From the beginning of the 20th century until 1945 in America, the dominant movement was modernism. It's debated on as to whether or not it began in the 1890s or not, but it was definitely in full swing by the end of the First World War. Within the modern period was the Harlem Renaissance, which spanned from about 1920 to 1940. And during this time, the modernists took pieces and parts of the realism and naturalism styles that preceded the modern era. So what was happening at this time? Between 1901 and 1945, you have the First World War, which began in 1914, ended in 1919. America didn't join until 1917, however. After that, the Harlem Renaissance began at about 1920 and didn't end until 1940. Also, the Great Depression soon followed in 1929, ended in 1939. This had a large effect on some of the literature that came out shortly after that, as well as the Dust Bowl, which affected the Middle America. Between 1935 and 1938, this was a massive drought that trashed the agriculture in the area. World War II started in 1939 and ended in 1945, and America did not join until 1941. So what were the main characteristics of the time? There was a lack of continuity in the structure of the plot. You would bounce around the timeline and point of views of the characters, and this can make things seem just a little disjointed until you got the whole picture. Another characteristic was the departure from standard ways of representing characters. It was less about forcing the characters to adhere to a just-so behavior and more about giving them more autonomy to be a natural human. They were flawed beyond being a symbol of flaws, though there was still an increase in the use of metaphors and symbolism that did the works of previous eras. This is also where stream of consciousness would come in to give the reader a better sense of how these characters are coming to the conclusions that they are and how it affects their decision making. Lastly, there was a criticism of society, specifically politically and the social issues, some of which were addressed in the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance touched on the socioeconomic trials and racism of the time, along with a reclaiming of culture for the Black American community. This did include the immigrants from Caribbean nations that had emigrated to Harlem. It was a meshing of cultures. It was a way to define themselves and in some cases criticize the overall American culture. You have to remember that the Jim Crow laws were still in effect in most of the South from the Reconstruction period in the 19th century, and it didn't end until the 60s. Discrimination was still taken to an extreme throughout America, so there was plenty of material to trash. Two of the three genres I picked may seem slightly out there, specifically the last one. Just a reminder that this was a time where artists were rewriting the rules and exploring experimenting. The push for social change and criticism of the upper class comes into play for the second genre, while the last one focuses more heavily on how characters are developed for an audience. So the first genre is the realistic fiction. So following the downfall of people in their state of being and mind, you have to remember that most of this era takes place at the start of World War I and ends with World War II. Artists were questioning the state of mankind and how quick we are to jump into violence, and how innovation has led to an uptick in violence, but not because it's evil, but because people are misusing it. There's also the fact that the Great Depression hurt the working class the most, along with the Dust Bowl incident, and this set a lot of people back financially that quickly became a recurring theme. This particular genre was a way to be heard, and there was less romanticizing the lives of the working class. It wasn't this rustic aesthetic, but a hard and sparse life. This is also where some of the works of the Harlem Renaissance come in, as it was meant to be a reclaiming of culture and representing what life was really like. Two books from this genre would be This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This one is a tragedy with romantic elements, but it focuses on a soldier who fell in love twice, but was left for someone else. He was stationed during the war between these two lovers, and then in the end lost his dear friend as well. The second one was Home to Harlem by Claude McKay. This one is most definitely realism, but to a point. It depicted these snapshots of Harlem nightlife, which was met with a lot of criticism because of the content and how it didn't truly represent Harlem per some people's opinions, just because of how risque it was, and just how it did not mesh well with the more clean-cut message they were trying to send their audiences. The second one is romance. The romantic genre is not our modern interpretation of it. It's more the romanticizing of something. It's the ideal, the wish, the hope, but it's not always going to wind up being the reality. Traditionally in this genre, the relationships between the man and the woman were meant to be expressed as a partnership, not one of romance, just because of court life. It was about seeking a balance. There are the relationships between the characters, the trials they face together, and then the positive outcome of their eventual partnership during the climax. In today's time, we see it as this lovey-dovey genre where one character tries to woo another. The stories in this genre are supposed to have an optimistic ending, but that doesn't always happen. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton is the first book I picked out. It's a romantic tragedy featuring a man who is to marry one woman, but falls in love with another. He has to decide how to proceed, and he winds up choosing to stay with his fiancée rather than ditching the social norms and marrying the woman he loves. This follows the more traditional partnership ending rather than a loving one, and due to Wharton's upper-class upbringing, this is also a reflection and critique of that particular lifestyle. Gone with the Wind is another one by Margaret Mitchell. This is also a period romance/drama that focuses on the more serious point of, are you willing to work for it, or are you going to sit back and give up? That's the trial. It's not an accurate portrayal of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period due to how it romanticizes the way of life before and after the war. Yes, work was involved in the aftermath with a shared goal, but the antebellum aesthetic of it all didn't represent the whole of Georgia at the time. This book can be attributed to our own romanticized idea of plantation life. As this book came out during the recovery of the Great Depression, the meaning behind working to pick yourself back up after tragedy and hoping for a better future would be appealing to the readers. The third genre that I picked is the crime fiction. This features a detective usually of some kind or another, and there's a difference between the hard-boiled and the classical detective. But both follow the same formula of the crime plus the victim plus the detective equals your problem has been solved. The deviation comes from what the detective is like and how they solve the mystery. So are they almost superhumanly brilliant? Do they maybe have a personal investment in the crime that's taken place where it's a neighbor or a friend who's part of the puzzle? Does the crime take them outside of the city? And are they all for solving a very clear-cut puzzle? If so, then you may have a classical detective with a very standard plot line. The hard-boiled detective can have a far more personal investment in the situation because of the problem itself, because of their morals, and those involved have a much larger impact on the detective and their personal values and identity. It falls in line with the psychological focus on characters that became popular during this period, because you would get to see the slow decline in the character. It's meant to be in the city, it's meant to be gritty and have that film noir feeling to it, which that particular genre was inspired by this. And it's meant to have the detective question themselves and what they knew before. This brand of fiction started to rise in popularity in the 1920s. With a darker outlook on humanity and technology post-World War I, detective novels featuring the main character exposing the corruption of humanity by almost any means necessary could be appealing. And it still is. This has evolved into the exhausted trend of crime shows and remakes of classical and hard-boiled detectives that we see today. For a few examples of today's media, you would have CSI, Bones, and even House. And yes, I will argue that House toes the line of mystery. The Continental Op would be the first book that I have chosen by Dashiell Hammett. It's a long-running mystery series that followed a detective that goes by the name of Op. As the series progresses, Op slowly spirals into a dark mindset after seeing corruption and the hatred of mankind for so many years. Hammett is considered to be one of the pioneers in the creation of the crime fiction genre. The Big Sleep is the second one. This one is written by Raymond Chandler. This is one novel of many intended one-shot novels and short stories. The detective in this series is named Philip Marlowe, and he has some of the same issues as Op. As with Hammett, Chandler is also considered one of the leaders in crime fiction. The first author is Claude McKay, who was born in Jamaica in 1889 and died in 1948. He moved to New York in 1912, and from there he would periodically travel to Europe and Russia. Because of his upbringing, because of his travels, he was very anti-imperialist, and writing characteristic-wise, it led to him being a bit more aggressive in how he approached change. He also published under male and female pen names, and for his lifestyle, he was seen taking both male and female lovers, and his poetry would reflect that as well, more than his prose, because he wouldn't specify gender. In today's terms, he would have been considered bisexual, but because of the time, obviously he wouldn't have been able to come out officially. Everything would have to remain hush-hush. When he was still in Jamaica, he was mostly writing poetry, and he kept to more of a Jamaican patois, which was African English Creole. And after he came to the States, he phased it out to use more standard conservative English in his work. And on top of that, with his style, he also covered more secular themes, such as the nightlife in Harlem, which I mentioned in his book Home to Harlem. He was not afraid to step on toes, is for sure. Some of the awards he won were the Musgrave Medal from the Jamaican Institute of Arts and Sciences. His books Harlem Shadow and Home to Harlem earned him the Harman Foundation Award for his success in literature from the NAACP. He also earned the James Weldon Johnson Literary Guild Award. Edith Wharton was born in 1862 and died in 1937. She was born to an upper-class family in New York. However, she was raised and lived in Europe for long periods throughout her life. Much of her work focused on the upper-class lifestyle because that was what she grew up in. And it was both an in-depth look into what it was like in the high life, and it was also a criticism. While she did write realistic fiction, she also wrote nonfiction on the subjects of architecture, gardening, design, and more. In her younger years, it was still a time where women were discouraged from seeking more outside of the home, so her work was privately published for a while. Because of her life, she was able to take inspiration from Henry James, where it concerned tackling the issues surrounding ethics. Her work was also very analytical of the upper-class society and how they had reacted to the sudden social and economical changes in America. Some of her short stories also showed off her knack for satire and comedy. A good joke can soften the blow. She won a Pulitzer Prize for literature in her novel The Age of Innocence, which I mentioned earlier. So John Steinbeck was born in 1902 and died in 1968. He was born in California, is best known for his story The Grapes of Wrath. A lot of the hard labor described in his books was from personal experience, both as just how his life went and him actively seeking it out to better understand what was going on. It made his work more authentic for what people in the Middle and West America went through as the economy declined and during the period of time where the Dust Bowl was causing a lot of problems in the agriculture aspect of the economy. He was also a war correspondent in World War II, and then after the war, his work was a little bit more gentle on how he criticized what he saw. A common theme throughout his work was to look into the harsh lives of people in the West and what they experienced in regards to problems with nature, with each other, and the economy itself. So this is mostly during and after the Great Depression and the droughts that came with the Dust Bowl. So there was also a lot of poverty. He also included an abundance of migrant characters. There were also a few moments of humor, but for the most part he kept a realist's tone in his criticism of the systems that were failing the working class. He wanted to show how easy it was to be left behind. His work is also known for the naturalist elements that I mentioned were present in this time period. Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize, the National Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize in his lifetime. So this was the modernist period. It was new, exciting, gritty, and a time of experimentation. Rules were thrown out the window for the sake of newness where anything goes. They didn't hold back from calling society out and questioning how we as a whole view the world, the definition of good and evil, and the meaning of progress. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.